welcome Eric Friedman on stage. Please give him a round of applause. Eric, please join us. Thank you. Please. So, Eric, whom many of you might have seen on our virtual edition a few years back, he's been the co-founder and former CTO at Fitbit, which has quite some notoriety, especially in Romania, because you used to have a large part of your team here. You brought the company from startup to IPO and then to an exit to Google. You've spent 17 plus years in wearables. You have shipped more than 140 million devices, which is quite remarkable. You've also before been a serial founder at Haypix. You've been a Microsoft engineer, so I think a lot of people here can do that. And now you're launching your next startup with James Park, and again with a Romanian R&D hub. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about scaling, exits, and what founder blind spots to avoid, especially from a serial founder like yourself. So let's dive right into this.
Sounds good.
All right. So you launched consumer hardware in 2007, way before it was cool and sexy, and well before Kickstarter or any VC appetite in gadgets. What convinced you back in that time that it was the right thing to do?
Stupidity. And I will say, most startups that succeed, if they knew all the hurdles they were going to face, they would never be dumb enough to launch them. So you do need to be hopefully not too stupid, but a little bit fearless in terms of jumping in. So my co-founder and I were both software people by training. We figured, hey, we both took a basic circuits class and built a calculator with some ICs. How can hardware be? It's basically Legos. You stick it on a board. And we learned a lot of things along the way about why it's called hardware. It's hard. But actually, the other thing that was kind of amusing, now that I'm in my 40s, I was in my late 20s. I think our third it was our third startup. And we're like, hey, we're getting old. And we need something with a really nice barrier to entry. Hardware seems like we'll have a barrier to entry that two young kids in a garage can't outcode us. And so that's part of the reason we did Fitbit. Then we thought it was a really cool idea that we were working on.
Wow. End of 20s and getting old, man. You're like making me feel really bad now.
I feel bad too, so it's...
You too. No, and the other thing... Well, the other thing I wanted to ask is basically, we talked earlier with Sasha a little bit about motivation, right? So we talked about why is the right moment, but I want to also ask you, what was your motivation to start it?
Yeah, so it was interesting just hearing Sarah speak, and it was great talk. Startups, the founder and a VC have very different motivations and very different modes of operating. And so from my perspective, the things that were motivating starting the company were, A, we've got an idea we're passionate about, that we think has real product market potential. B, we think that it can really apply to users. We think we could change users' lives, where the user could be individual, like mom and dad, or the user could be large company. You can do this equally relevant to B2B type stuff. The other thing that was motivational was building a team. To me, the two things that are fun is I could change people's lives, and I could build a team that was kind of rallying around something where we're mission driven. And then I think if you have that and have a lot of luck, then you can have those billion-dollar outcomes. And by the way, you can have a life-changing outcome at well under $1 billion, I will say.
What did you picture as success? When you started, what was in your mind where said, when I have achieved that, I would consider this a big success? Did you have that?
Yeah, so I remember, first of all, when we launched, we thought success would be selling 100,000 units. That would be mind-blowing success. In retrospect, that seems very quaint. Two is, I remember hiring an early employee, pinching him and hey, I bet we could get to a $300 million revenue company someday. And he discounted that down to 100 million. And within a year, we actually beat 300. So again, lots of luck involved in that. But to me, success was how many users I thought we could get. And that's the fact that Fitbit became a household name, that to me is the most shocking thing, and in some ways the most rewarding.
From 100,000 to 100 million, is a tremendous. So, sorry, I think this one doesn't. All right, sorry. So in the first few months, what was the single hardest technical hurdle you had to overcome?
So part of it was learning hardware. So I actually thought a lot about this question. So the question is, so let me give you a very specific example that's not going to be relevant to almost anyone else in the room. And then I'll kind of talk about something that might be a little bit more relevant. So the non-relevant thing was the original Fitbit was actually a clip. Most people probably don't remember that. How do you kind of connect two surfaces, but yet make them serviceable? We use something called ultrasonic welding to kind of melt two pieces of plastic. That was highly technically complex and something well outside of any of our skill houses. And in fact, we didn't know enough to pick the right mechanical engineering firm. So we picked somebody who knew how to build static things. We were trying to build something that flexed, and that was also outside of their skill wheelhouse. I think the toughest hurdle that's kind of relevant maybe to this group is thinking about scaling for the future, like on the system side. So like, Fitbit was actually originally started as a social company to try and drive to that large scale, where again, large for us was much smaller than we actually got to. And so thinking about like, when do you build for scale? Because if you don't build for scale, you'll fall over and you'll spend all your time trying to fix things. But yet, I remember in some of the early stage meetings, like when we'd go to these parties that were hosted by our early stage VCs, there were the companies that focused on how do I make my infrastructure scale? And there were ones who would talk about how do I ship? And at the Series B, none of the ones who were focused on scale were there, but all the ones who were figuring out how to ship were all complaining like, oh my God, I'm falling over all the time. How do I solve that? And so I think really trying to do that balance, because you can't be completely ignorant on scale, that's probably one of the bigger technical hurdles.
Yeah, quite ironic, by the way, that I'm talking to the god of hardware, and then our hardware, the microphones fail here. So anyway, but as always, good to have a backup in hardware. So overcoming these technical hurdles and all these challenges sounds like you've built something that has decent defensibility after all. So your initial thesis might have not been wrong after all. But I want to also ask you another question. This goes often to when do you listen to advice and when you defy outside advice, right? Like right now, it's very fashionable. Like founder mode is the very, very hype term that is used right now. But in these early days, I want to ask you, can you give me an example where you defied outside advice that you said many people, be it VCs, be it existing founders, have given you and you've defied it and it has hopefully turned out well?
So maybe kind of rewinding, how do you get that advice in the first place? I think what shocked me the most in the early stages of Fitbit was we would just email people blindly and say, hey, will you talk to us and share information, whether it be investors or founders? People find that very complimentary and will give you advice. I kind of seconding Sarah's thing of don't be afraid to reach out to people. You might not hear from them. Sometimes ping them a second time. People are often busy, but people will give you advice. And in some ways, the most useful thing about that advice is often not the specific advice. So you do learn themes. One piece of advice that I remember getting from actually a VC who would invest in a company called Jawbone was, whatever you do, don't build custom charging contacts. Go with a standard charging contact system. And we thanked them for their advice. We promptly ignored it. And the thing that almost prevented us from shipping was our custom charging contact. And by the way, that cost us $5 in BOM. The way you think about BOM, bill of materials, to retail is 4x. So that was basically a $20 adder to the effectively the retail cost of our product. Was this brilliant custom charging contacts. It didn't work. But the fact that we got that advice, when we stepped on that landmine, we're like, oh, that ticking, we know it's going to come next. And so we could brace ourselves and prepare for it. And so in some ways, the best advice, even if you don't follow it, allows you to prepare for what's going to happen next.
That's a great nuance, right? Consider it, but be well aware of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Consider it and sometimes ignore it. You'll get a lot of conflicting advice because there's multiple paths to success.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of the Elon and SpaceX stories, right? He has defied advice of how to build rockets, but he was very well aware how was the common way to build rockets, right? He's not delusional, followed a different path, but he said okay, I understood what the advice is, but I consciously choose to ignore it, right? Like that's kind of like what you're saying. So don't ignore it without at least deeply understanding it. Is that
That is very much the case.
okay? No, that makes perfect sense. So let's go on a little bit like to the still early days, but maybe a little bit beyond like the super early days. So what signal told you that Fitbit as a product was ready to ship and let loose on users? Even it might have still felt a bit rough.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the biggest challenges I think a startup takes or has, because first of all, we all know what the vision is, and invariably your first product launch falls so far short of your vision that it just feels like a radical disappointment. In fact, James and I had kind of the MVP list, minimum viable product list of what we would never ship without. And we did finish everything on that list. We finished it about a year before our IPO, so about 4 years after launching. So clearly we were very bad about figuring out what true MVP was. I do think that trying to kind of constrain how much money you have forces you to launch. Like you eventually we're like, oh, let's build, let's go wild. Oh my God, we see the bank account slowly shrinking. That in some ways was the biggest motivator to launch. We also gave it to friends and family and started getting some, didn't tell them, here's where we want to go, and started getting some positive feedback. And those two things kind of converged enough to make us, hey, this feels real.
I love the advice that sometimes like the constraints can actually be what drives you forward, and like that's also like a common theme I heard from many successful founders and entrepreneurs. And you touched also like on the like money running out. We just had like Sarah, a venture capitalist here. I want to ask you from the other side of that. What lessons have you learned running a venture-backed company, and what would you like to share with the audience here?
So I've run 2 venture-backed companies and now 2 non-venture-backed companies. So I think, it was fascinating hearing the other side. It's like kind of like you're on a date and you always want to know, like, what is my date thinking about what I'm saying? And so it's great to actually hear what Sarah was thinking. And I think one of the truths she told was that they want $1 billion or bust in their exit. And as a founder, and as a VC, they make many bets. So she has no problem walking away from a $100,000 loss. As a founder, you have one pile of money. When that's gone, it is game over. And so the VCs want you to either burn super bright and be marvelously successful, or snuff out as quickly as possible so you can stop dumping money into you. Whereas as a founder, I won't lie, multi-billion-dollar exits are a great thing to have, but I also had, my first exit was a $4 million exit, and I will say that was life-changing. That enabled me to go and do hardware and fund the early stages myself and get very far. And so, don't underestimate the value of those smaller exits, and the VCs don't want that. And so I think really thinking about what do you want? Actually, I think in some ways, one of the worst things that's happening in the industry now is these massively increased rounds, which is just throwing so much capital, which means that it's really, all those startups were adding real value, building something real that could then be acquired where the early VCs would see a return, the founder would see a return, so everyone was happy with the exit. Now are disappointments. And I think that's not good for the industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Right? Like, there's been like $100 million exits where the founder basically walked away with potentially nothing.
Yeah.
And like, so that definitely has happened.
And forget the founder, the employees. Like to me, I would love to see all of our early employees walk away millionaires. And how do I make that? Not have to be a multi-billion-dollar exit to make that happen. And it's like one of the early Fitbit employees, he's now retired in Costa Rica, living his best life with his family. And that's actually really rewarding. In some ways, that's more rewarding than anything I got. It's like knowing that I was able to do that for him.
That's wonderful. So knowing all what you know, is your current company still venture-backed or going to be venture-backed?
Not at the moment. There are definitely times when like throwing capital in the fire is really helpful. There are also multiple paths to capital. Venture is one. There's something called venture debt, where they take a little bit of equity and they loan you money. There's also other types of debts, like you can do receivables financing. One of the, I would say we lucked into this at Fitbit was our manufacturer accidentally financed us. Yes, they basically gave us net 90-day terms we would ship all of our products immediately out of the door because we had a backlog. Credit cards paid us immediately, so we basically got free financing for 90 days, and we would have run out of money had it not happened. Entirely accidental, by the way, but there are multiple ways of financing a company.
Good, solid advice. So I want to shift gears in the time you sold Fitbit to Google. So post-acquisition, what surprised you the most, and how was it to innovate inside Google?
I think so. Every day at Fitbit was the biggest thing I've ever run, biggest thing my business partner ran, and for pretty much all of our leadership teams, the biggest thing they've run. And I was really expecting to get to Google and go, oh, 120,000 person company, they figured it all out. And it was shocking that they hadn't figured it all out. And in some ways, a little bit disappointing because I was hoping to get the answers I could then apply for the next one. But it also really taught me why small startups can run around. Because you don't have to bring in all the different decision makers. Also, I learned a lot about, Google seems to be very centralized in decision making. The value of if you want a globally distributed team, how do you become multi-homed? Sorry, it's an engineering term, versus hub and spoke, where everything has to go back to the mothership. Because making people in Romania work at 3 a.m. to join a Google call, that's not very satisfying. That being said, I've also learned the value, both from Fitbit and Google, the value of having that money printing machine in the back room, and also the sins that can cover in terms of organizational structure. So that sounds very negative. So let me talk about a positive thing. One of the things I actually think that made the acquisition and merger successful, Fitbit and Google had a very collaborative culture. And I think with entrepreneurs, you often see, the Elon, the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gates, this Jeff Bezos, hey, to be a successful entrepreneur, you've got to scream, you've got to yell, it's got to be a very conflicting culture. Nobody talks about the NVIDIA culture, the Google culture. These very large companies can be built on very collaborative cultures, and things move at a different pace. They operate differently, but you can have a very successful company without the kind of imperious kind of executive leadership style, which then trickles down in the culture of the company.
Super, super interesting. So looking back at the Fitbit journey, what advice would you give to hardware founders? So one rule maybe, what they should do and what they shouldn't do.
Let me start with general founders, and we'll work our way to hardware. So 2 rules for all founders, I feel like, are I agree with the luck comment. Never attribute to skill what can be attributed to luck. You've got to, to be a successful company, you've got to pitch and truly believe your pitch, whether it be the pitch to customers, the pitch to investors, the pitch to employees to get people to join your crazy vision. But you can't drink your own Kool-Aid. You can't overly believe in your own pitch. You've got to pitch it like it is nothing, but you've got to then kind of also self-question it and self-doubt. The other thing is, you got 1 bucket of money when you run out. For hardware specific, I think, again, 2 things, and I apologize, I'm not concise, not my skill set. One is, how do you align customer interests with your own? Hardware is a very cutthroat kind of business. And so if you're, especially in consumer hardware, you're trying to sell somebody the next thing for next Christmas, if you've got a software component where you're trying to add new value, how do you make sure people keep paying you for that value? Otherwise, you're just focused on buying that next product, which means you tick off all your current customers, which means they don't become repeat customers. So how do you keep that virtuous cycle going? And the other thing about hardware is you've got to understand what kind of hardware company you are. So in China, they're really good at fast following. They know how to build things really cheap. They know how to move cheaply. They have very low overhead. They've got very low salaries. As a San Francisco-based company, we had none of that. So understanding what was our core value add, for example, Apple's value add is fashion, not necessarily some of the other things. Knowing the difference between Samsung and Apple and where their skills are is really important. And so therefore, same thing for yourselves.
Very, 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 very insightful. Yeah, and I mean, what you said, right, like about this repeat cycles, I mean, Apple has perfected that, right? Like they know that people every 2-3 years are gonna buy the next iPhone, and the software updates in the meantime keep them loyal to the ecosystem, and that's been like what's been their cash printing machine at the end of the day.
Yes, but they're operating at a very different scale, and they also have different margins. Like you look at Apple's margins relative to Google's margins, it's just a different business model, and they don't necessarily graft well onto each other.
Yeah, no, totally. Um, Now, again, you're like outside of Google, of course, back into founder mode. What can you tell us about your new startup, if anything?
Uh, it's based in Romania. We are hiring. If you're a good engineer, and if you're a mediocre engineer, still call me. And if you're a great designer, great product person, so yeah, call me. Top secret, it's AI based. I know it's going to come to a shock to everybody. But in all seriousness, we're staying in the consumer space. We think there's a lot of really cool stuff to do there. We think that consumer health is particularly interesting. It tends to be, women make most of the health buying decisions in a family. They're chief medical officer in most family units. That's a global phenomenon, which is why if you're a non-government organization, you want to improve the health of a society, you funnel money through kind of female population. A lot of tech companies, especially in the Bay Area, tend not to invest in, like they tend to be run by men. They tend not to invest in kind of companies that have a core female audience. And so, my previous company before Fitbit was photo sharing, about 70% female. Fitbit skewed heavily female. And so we think that's a really exciting place to play.
Okay, if you want to find out, I guess you need to interview because he's keeping it very, very tight. So, being a serial entrepreneur, where do you think the past experience makes you a better founder in the startup, and where do you think it might potentially make you a worse founder?
So yeah, if given what I know about Fitbit, I would never be dumb enough to start Fitbit. And so actually, James, my business partner, spent a lot of time talking about that. Like there's a bunch of things where we have probably spent $50,000, $100,000 on legal bills that we never did at Fitbit, which is how we got Fitbit from zero to launch on $2.5 million, was because we didn't know better, so we didn't spend money on that. And so, there's various things like, oh, we want to protect ourselves on this legal thing, or like, oh, we're giving equity to somebody in the Netherlands. How do we make sure that we know all the financial systems? We didn't know that there would be different financial structures between Europe and the US when we started Fitbit, so everyone just got equity and we figured that out on the back end. The same thing's true, like thinking about scale. Like you can overthink scaling engineering problems, and so I think with experience comes all those burns, and you kind of reflexively try and avoid being burned again, which can both be good and be a burden. I will say also, as I've aged, my network has aged, and when I started Fitbit in my 20s, the people I know were in their 20s. They weren't quite eating ramen, but they were willing to work for a lot less. Now people have families, they've got houses, they want money when we start. And so the cost of getting the people we know is hiring from within your network. You're going to get better people faster who are probably more loyal. And so I think that's been really valuable.
Okay, very, 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 very interesting. Well, I mean, good advantage for all the ramen eating, like young folks in the audience, that there's still like an edge that they can have being a first time founder. The other thing I find fascinating, and you alluded to this, that for your new startup, the engineering team will be also in significant parts in Romania. So just given the place where we are, what convinced you to open the dev hub in Romania again?
Yeah, so I will say part of the reason I have experience with Romania, so Fitbit had a large presence in Romania. We grew to about 300 people. We acquired a Romanian startup called Vector Watch, and we got pitched by many, many startups, and we were looking for kind of one that had some interesting technology and could roll into the team. And I remember meeting with kind of the team at Vector Watch, and we were talking about the business, and a lot of it sounded very normal. And then there was a discussion on fibers, and fibers are something in operating. So it was a very geeky conversation. But I saw their eyes light up, and that was really compelling. Like when people's eyes light up about technology, when it lights about a product. And so what I found is within kind of Vector, and then as we scaled the team, there were people who understood the same product sensibilities that we had in the US, and were great engineers, and had that level of enthusiasm. It definitely skewed a little bit younger, and there's that great enthusiasm of youth that was a little bit contagious. So that's kind of what caused us to go from like, a 17-person team that we acquired to a 300-person team. When I started Fitbit, part of the goal was to get the band back together. Like, bringing in people that we knew who were just rock stars. It's an overused metaphor, so I apologize. But like people, like we knew how they worked. We knew we liked them. We liked them as people. They had the same moral basis that we did. They had the same product ideas that we did. But they also knew us well enough to turn to James and myself and go, that is the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Because it's very easy to just kind of get that echo chamber, especially if you hire people where people tell you, oh, that's brilliant. And that's an easy way to fail. And so we knew some of those people. And so there's a guy, Daniel Rizea, who said, hey, let's get him to join us. He brought in some other people that we also knew from Fitbit and from Vector. And so we've been building that team there, and it's been great.
I really like what you said about the echo chamber. Do you feel as you got more successful, people have a harder time like telling you you're wrong? Is that something you're observing?
I think both you're wrong, and also, I think part of the way, like James and I like to riff on each other. Like we'll throw out some very outlandish ideas, but it's part of the way we push the envelope to figure out and also pressure test where we're going. And so I remember as Fitbit scale, when we got to about 1,200 people, I remember throwing out a crazy idea, and I forget what the idea was. I was like, hey, this is a dumb idea. What do you think of blank? And then 3 weeks later, I was in a meeting. There was 30 people in the room. I was sitting on the floor in the corner, so no one was really quite aware. And people said, Eric said we should do this. And I raised my hand, I'm like, no, I said this is a dumb idea. What do you think about it? But it generated a lot of work and attention, things like that. So being able to have people that can know to push back and can cut that off early is really valuable.
Makes total sense. All right, closing question. So let's fast forward to 2030. What does success look like for both you personally as well as for digital health as a category?
So for me personally, it would be having an engaged team that had found what we're working on to be just emotionally satisfying and kind of intellectually really challenging. And the thing I liked about Fitbit is we had millions of users all over the world. I remember the first time I flew on a plane and saw a stewardess making, stewardesses don't make that much money, who spent her hard-earned money on a $100 Fitbit, which was a lot of money relative to the salary. That was just a wow moment. And so to me, being able to kind of impact people's health at scale, that's the goal. What does success look like for health in general? I think we're in a weird time. The health care system just doesn't scale. First of all, Europe, US, aging populations, doctors are extremely expensive to train, and also they don't scale. They see you for 15 minutes if you're lucky. They see you once a year, and they're really good at you got cancer, you've got a major health issue. The medical system's really good about dealing with that. But more chronic type things, more lifestyle things that develop over time, things that take knowledge of you. The reason this is happening is because you're burning the midnight oil, you're not sleeping enough, which is then kind of generating some heart disease, which has all these other things. But the reason you're doing this is because your kids need help with their homework. How all that fits together, that's not how the medical system's set up, but that is important for the next stage in health and taking care of people. And I think just trying to solve that is something that can leave the world a better place than when I entered it. And so we'll see.
Sounds like a very worthy challenge. Thank you so much, Eric. Please give him a big round of applause.